The Zodiac Killer remains one of America's most terrifying and enduring true crime mysteries, a chilling phantom who haunted Northern California during the late 1960s, stalking lovers' lanes, sending coded letters to newspapers, taunting police with riddles, and claiming victims with a ruthless calmness that still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who dares to revisit his story. And to begin unraveling the nightmare that became known as the Zodiac case, one must travel back to the turbulent years of the late 1960s, when the United States was already gripped by civil unrest, the Vietnam War, counterculture movements, and a deep sense of paranoia spreading across the nation. And into this atmosphere of anxiety stepped an elusive predator who seemed to thrive on fear as much as on murder, a man, or perhaps even a collective, who styled himself not just as a killer, but as a figure larger than life. A bogeyman who signed his letters with a chilling crosshair-like symbol, a circle with a cross through it, and who called himself Zodiac, as if to declare that he operated according to his own cosmic rules, untouchable and eternal. The story truly begins on December 20th, 1968, when two young high school students, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, decided to spend an evening together on their first official date, driving out to a secluded lover's lane spot on Lake Herman Road, near Vallejo, California, a location known for quiet seclusion, but also the kind of place that predators could exploit. And as the night grew darker, the two teenagers sat together in their car, unaware that their tender moments would become the beginning of a reign of terror that is yet to find closure. Because at around 11 p.m., another vehicle pulled up beside them, its headlights casting an eerie glow across the dirt road, and from that car stepped a figure, unidentified, silent, methodical, who approached with the calm assurance of someone in complete control. Within moments, David Faraday had been shot point-blank in the head, killed instantly, and Betty Lou Jensen was forced to flee, running desperately into the cold December night, only to be shot 5 times in the back as she collapsed lifelessly on the ground, her body lying in the dirt. A haunting scene that investigators later described as one of the most cold-blooded executions they had ever encountered. And though at first it seemed to police that this was an isolated lover's lane attack, the darkness of the act hinted at something far more sinister, a shadow that was only beginning to reveal itself. 7 months later, on the night of July 4th, 1969, Vallejo once again became the setting for unimaginable horror when Darlene Farron, a 22-year-old waitress, decided to meet up with 19-year-old Michael Mageau at Blue Rock Springs Park, another secluded area favored by young couples. And as they sat in Darlene's car, talking and enjoying the warm summer night, another vehicle slowly rolled into the parking lot, pulling up behind them, then suddenly speeding away, only to return minutes later, parking directly beside them. And from the shadows emerged a man carrying a flashlight and a 9mm handgun, who without a word began firing mercilessly into the car, bullets shattering glass, tearing through flesh, as Michael cried out in pain and Darlene collapsed mortally wounded. The attacker then casually walked away, but moments later returned to fire additional rounds into their helpless bodies before finally vanishing into the night. And though Darlene would not survive, Michael Mageau, gravely wounded, lived to tell police a harrowing account of the attack, describing the shooter as a stocky man with short hair. Though shaken and in shock, his words became the first eyewitness testimony connected to what was soon to be known as the Zodiac Killer. But what made this crime even more chilling was not just the brutal murder, but the phone call that followed less than an hour later, when the Vallejo Police Department received a call from a man speaking in a monotone, emotionless voice, who confessed to the Blue Rock Springs shooting and casually mentioned his involvement in the Lake Herman Road murders as well, saying, "I want to report a double murder. If you'll go 1 mile east, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year," and then hung up, leaving officers stunned because this was not the act of a panicked criminal trying to escape justice, but rather a cold declaration, as if the killer wanted recognition, attention, and notoriety, as if killing alone was not enough unless the world knew it was his hand behind the blood. The newspapers soon received chilling letters, written in a strange, mocking tone, filled with puzzles and cryptograms that the writer demanded be published on the front page, and each letter bore the now infamous crosshair symbol, along with the name Zodiac, a self-chosen title that suggested arrogance, mystery, and a taunting of fate itself. And though many killers throughout history have hidden in silence, the Zodiac instead stepped into the spotlight, playing a dangerous game with the media, police, and the public, one that would stretch on for years and become one of the most infamous criminal sagas in American history. The people of California were suddenly gripped by fear, as ordinary couples wondered if the next romantic evening out could turn into a nightmare, while detectives struggled with the fact that they were now dealing with a murderer unlike any they had ever pursued, one who seemed to blend reality with theater, crime with performance, and murder with an insatiable hunger for recognition. And with the Lake Herman Road murders, the Blue Rock Springs attack, and the terrifying phone call, the Zodiac Killer had announced himself to the world, setting into motion a series of events that would confound authorities, terrify communities, and secure his place in the annals of true crime legend forever. In the weeks following the brutal Blue Rock Springs attack, the mysterious figure who called himself Zodiac transformed from a shadowy murderer into a terrifying public presence by launching a campaign of written terror that would captivate and horrify the entire nation. Because on August 1st, 1969, three major newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner, each received a nearly identical letter, written in shaky block handwriting and opening with the ominous words, "Dear Editor, I am the killer of the two teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl last 4th of July." And though the newspapers at first suspected a hoax, the letters contained chilling details that only the true killer could have known, forcing editors and police to accept that the man now styling himself as Zodiac was indeed the same person behind the unsolved murders. But what made these letters infamous was not just the confession, but the fact that each one contained a section of a cryptogram, a cipher composed of over 400 strange symbols arranged in lines of code, accompanied by a demand that the ciphers be printed on the front page of each paper, or else Zodiac threatened to embark on a weekend killing spree targeting random people, promising to cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again, until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend. And this shocking ultimatum forced newspapers into an impossible ethical dilemma. Should they give a platform to a murderer by publishing his words, or risk the blood of innocent lives by refusing? And in the end, fearing public safety, the newspapers published the ciphers, printing them in full on August 2nd, sparking a frenzy as amateur sleuths, cryptographers, and ordinary readers across the Bay Area began attempting to crack the bizarre code. And just 1 week later, a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty managed to solve the cryptogram, which unveiled a message as chilling as the crimes themselves. Reading in part, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." And though the message offered no clue to the killer's identity, it revealed his twisted philosophy, that murder was not just compulsion but entertainment, a dark echo of Richard Connell's famous story, The Most Dangerous Game, in which humans themselves become prey. And this revelation cemented Zodiac not just as a murderer, but as a sadistic showman, eager to terrify and eager to control the narrative. Emboldened by the attention, the killer sent yet another letter on August 7th, this time to the San Francisco Examiner, beginning with the unforgettable line, "This is the Zodiac speaking," a chilling phrase that would soon become his trademark introduction, a signature that was both arrogant and theatrical. And in this letter, he further mocked the police for their incompetence, ridiculed investigators for failing to catch him, and gloated about his crimes as if he were directing a macabre play with himself as the star performer. Soon, more letters followed, each one dripping with menace, often accompanied by fresh ciphers or threats. And while the public devoured newspaper headlines about the mysterious Zodiac Killer, law enforcement felt the pressure mounting as tips flooded in. Yet concrete leads remained elusive, because for every letter Zodiac sent, he grew more powerful in the public imagination. transforming into a boogeyman who could strike at any time and vanish without a trace. And while some citizens began living in fear of venturing outdoors at night, others became obsessed with solving his ciphers, treating them as puzzles in a deadly game. While all the time the killer himself seemed to relish the chaos he was causing, feeding on the terror like a parasite. The hysteria reached such a pitch that on September 27, 1969, the Zodiac escalated his crimes once more by attacking Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, two college students enjoying a picnic at Lake Berryessa, where the killer appeared in broad daylight wearing an executioner-style hood with his crosshair symbol emblazoned on his chest, a grotesque costume that cemented his theatrical persona, and he bound the terrified couple with clothesline rope before savagely stabbing them multiple times, then walking away into the woods, leaving behind not only his victims, Cecilia fatally wounded and Brian barely surviving, but also a message scrawled in black marker on the door of Hartnell's car, which read, Vallejo, December 20th, 68, July 4th, 69, September 27th, 69, 6:30 by knife, a chilling tally of his crimes, as if keeping score in his deadly game. Later that evening, Zodiac once again called the police to report the crime, calmly describing the murder and providing directions to the scene. A twisted ritual of confession that made clear he wanted the recognition, he wanted the fear, and he wanted the world to know that he controlled the narrative. And as media frenzy exploded after the Lake Berryessa attack, the Zodiac struck again just 2 weeks later on October 11th, when cab driver Paul Stein was shot in the head at point-blank range in San Francisco's Presidio Heights neighborhood, an attack seemingly without motive since robbery was ruled out. And what made this crime even more disturbing was that Zodiac mailed Stein's bloody shirt to the Chronicle as proof of his deed, mocking police and boasting of his ability to kill at will, further demonstrating that no one was safe, from teenage lovers in dark lanes to young students at a lakeside to a cab driver in a busy city street. Anyone could be his next victim. The letters became darker, his threats more brazen, including taunts about attacking school buses full of children, promising to shoot out the tires and pick off the kids as they come bouncing out, a statement that sent shockwaves of terror across California as schools began implementing strict safety protocols. Bus routes were monitored by police escorts, and parents lived in dread every time their children stepped outside. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies were overwhelmed, with local police, the FBI, and even military cryptographers drawn into the hunt. Yet Zodiac seemed always one step ahead, his true identity masked by his clever manipulation of fear and spectacle, and the sheer theatricality of his persona ensured that the public remained glued to newspapers, radios, and televisions, hanging on every new letter, every new cipher, every fresh taunt, as the Zodiac Killer transformed from a faceless murderer into a legend of living terror. An American nightmare whose story had only just begun to unfold. As the Zodiac Killer's letters grew bolder and his crimes more theatrical, law enforcement agencies across Northern California found themselves trapped in a desperate and frustrating game of cat and mouse, where every new clue seemed to dissolve into ambiguity and every promising lead collapsed into disappointment. For though the killer left behind bodies, bloody clothing, phone calls, and even his own handwriting, he remained a ghost, uncatchable and unfathomable, and this failure to apprehend him soon became one of the most agonizing aspects of the case, creating not just terror in the community, but humiliation for the police who were mocked directly in the Zodiac's letters. Investigators initially clung to the details offered by surviving witnesses, such as Michael Mageau from the Blue Rock Springs shooting, who described his attacker as a heavy-set man, around 5 feet 8 inches tall, with short brown hair and a round face. But the vagueness of the description meant it could fit thousands of men. In the Bay Area, and as time went on, the suspect pool swelled into the hundreds, each person scrutinized, fingerprinted, and interrogated, yet none yielding definitive proof, and the frustration only deepened when Zodiac himself seemed to toy with the process, sending letters mocking the police's inability to identify him, such as the one in which he wrote, "I have my bus bomb all ready," and yet dared the police to try to stop him. Among the earliest and most prominent suspects was Arthur Lee Allen, a former schoolteacher whose disturbing behavior and criminal history made him an enduring figure in the Zodiac investigation, because Allen had been fired for inappropriate conduct with children. Owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch that bore the same crosshair symbol as the killer's signature, and had even been heard by acquaintances boasting about wanting to kill couples and calling himself Zodiac before the crimes had become public knowledge. But despite his suspicious profile, every attempt to connect Allen definitively to the crimes failed. His fingerprints did not match those found on Zodiac letters. His handwriting was inconsistent with the samples, and when DNA testing later emerged. In the 1990s and 2000s, Allen's samples were also excluded, leaving investigators both convinced of his guilt and frustrated by the absence of conclusive evidence. And though Allen died in 1992, he remains perhaps the most famous suspect, a man who fits so many pieces of the puzzle but not enough to close the case. Beyond Allen, dozens of other suspects emerged, from career criminals to eccentric loners, each one for a time captivating the attention of investigators and the public, such as Rick Marshall, a movie projectionist whose interest in ciphers and obscure films made him intriguing but ultimately unprovable, or Lawrence Kane, a man with a history of stalking and sexual violence who matched witness descriptions and lived near several Zodiac crime scenes. But once again, the evidence never rose beyond circumstantial, and for every suspect investigated, there were dozens of false leads. Neighbors reporting strange men, handwriting experts disagreeing over samples, amateur sleuths, drowning the police in theories, so that the case files soon ballooned into thousands of pages of reports, tips, and dead ends. The pressure on law enforcement was immense, especially after the murder of cab driver Paul Stein in San Francisco, when eyewitnesses saw the killer fleeing the scene, describing him as a white male in his late 30s or 40s, barrel-chested and wearing glasses. And in fact, police officers even briefly stopped a man matching that description in the Presidio Heights neighborhood, but inexplicably let him go after being told they were searching for a black suspect, a devastating error that may have allowed the Zodiac himself to slip away just minutes after committing murder, and this incident became one of the most bitter failures of the investigation, a haunting reminder of how close they may have come to catching him. Meanwhile, as the letters continued, law enforcement agencies found themselves competing as much as cooperating, with Vallejo Police, Napa County Sheriff's Department, San Francisco Police, and the California Department of Justice all working separate angles, while the FBI monitored communications. But the lack of coordination often allowed evidence to be mishandled, suspects to slip through cracks, and crucial time to be wasted. Handwriting analysis, one of the primary tools used at the time, became a source of endless contention, with experts often disagreeing on whether samples matched Zodiac's blocky, misshapen script, while fingerprint evidence was likewise inconclusive, as partial prints lifted from letters and crime scenes could not be definitively linked to any suspect. As the years stretched on, the investigation became not only about catching a killer, but also about managing the hysteria of a terrified public. Because Zodiac's threats against schoolchildren had rattled the Bay Area so deeply that police escorts began shadowing buses, parents kept children home, and a climate of paranoia spread. With every crank call, every anonymous letter, every suspicious stranger becoming another possible manifestation of the killer. And this overwhelming atmosphere created a deluge of false leads, so that detectives were buried beneath mountains of irrelevant information, unable to separate the genuine clues from the noise. Meanwhile, the media coverage, fueled by Zodiac's own manipulative correspondence, amplified the mythos of the killer, so that his power lay not only in his violence, but in his ability to command headlines, to inspire terror far beyond the number of his actual victims. And as the investigation ground on with no resolution, the figure of Zodiac grew larger, more untouchable, until he seemed less like a man and more like an immortal phantom haunting California, a symbol of the failures of law enforcement and the vulnerability of ordinary citizens. By the early 1970s, despite the tireless efforts of dozens of detectives and agents, The Zodiac case was already slipping toward the realm of legend. And though new suspects would continue to appear, new letters would trickle in, and new theories would surface. The frustration of investigators was clear. They were chasing a ghost who left just enough evidence to tantalize, but never enough to capture. And in that uncertainty, the myth of the Zodiac thrived, becoming a story that would never truly end. By the time the Zodiac's letters, murders, and taunts had reached their fever pitch in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it became clear that his impact extended far beyond the crime scenes themselves. For unlike many serial killers who remained obscure until their eventual capture, the Zodiac deliberately engineered himself into a cultural figure, exploiting the media and feeding on the hysteria of the public until he transcended the role of a murderer and became a terrifying legend woven into the very fabric of American society. And his chilling phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking," echoed across newspaper headlines, television broadcasts, and radio reports, striking fear into homes across California as parents kept children inside. Couples avoided secluded roads, and ordinary citizens began scanning every face in the crowd with suspicion, wondering if the quiet neighbor or the man standing behind them at the grocery store could be the monster taunting police. Newspapers, hungry for circulation, published Zodiac's letters on their front pages, knowing they were both playing into his hands and serving the public's right to know, while talk shows, crime columnists, and editorial pages debated endlessly about his motives, his ciphers, and his threats, until the killer had achieved precisely what he wanted. Not merely to kill, but to terrify an entire region into submission. His shadow, stretching longer than his body count ever could. The cultural climate of the late 1960s, already turbulent with political assassinations, the Manson family murders, and rising crime, made the Zodiac's reign of terror especially potent because Americans were already losing faith in the stability of their institutions. And here was a killer who seemed to mock the very concept of law and order, proving that the police were powerless to protect the public, and that knowledge amplified his aura until the Zodiac seemed less like an individual and more like an unstoppable force. Hollywood and popular culture quickly seized upon the terror, with filmmakers, novelists, and television producers drawing inspiration from the case. Most famously in 1971, when director Don Siegel and actor Clint Eastwood brought to the screen the gritty cop thriller Dirty Harry, in which the villain, a sniper named Scorpio, was a thinly veiled stand-in for Zodiac, complete with taunting letters to police and threats against school children. And though the movie fictionalized events, audiences recognized instantly that the Scorpio killer was based on the real-life Zodiac, cementing his influence on American cinema and introducing the image of the taunting, theatrical serial killer into mainstream entertainment. As decades passed, this cinematic archetype grew into an entire genre, inspiring countless films, television series, novels, and documentaries, from David Fincher's 2007 masterpiece Zodiac, which meticulously recreated the investigation, to dozens of true crime specials and horror movies that borrowed elements of Zodiac style. The ciphers, the letters, the costume, the sense of omnipotence. And in doing so, the killer's mythos spread worldwide, until he became one of the most infamous criminals in history. His story told not only in police reports, but in popular imagination, beyond Hollywood. The Zodiac also influenced how law enforcement and the media handle criminals, because his manipulation of publicity exposed the dangers of giving killers a platform, and debates raged for years about whether newspapers should have published his ciphers, whether the attention emboldened him, and whether the cycle of terror had been prolonged by a press corps eager for headlines. But even with such criticism, it was undeniable that the Zodiac had changed the relationship between killers and the media forever, establishing a template that later criminals, from the Son of Sam in New York to modern internet-age threats, would attempt to imitate, writing manifestos, leaving symbols, demanding coverage. Socially, the Zodiac became a boogeyman figure, the faceless predator parents invoked to warn children about the dangers of strangers, a reminder that evil could be lurking anywhere, that violence could intrude into even the most ordinary spaces of daily life. And this legacy of fear persisted long after the killings themselves had ended, embedding itself in California's cultural memory. What made Zodiac unique was not merely the brutality of his crimes, but the deliberate construction of his persona as a mythic villain. A man who gave himself a name, a symbol, and a voice, shaping his own narrative until he existed, as much in imagination as in reality. And that dual existence ensured his immortality. Because while most killers fade from memory once their crimes cease, the Zodiac remained, endlessly studied, endlessly theorized, his letters archived, his ciphers reanalyzed, his identity debated by generations of true crime enthusiasts, professional detectives, and armchair sleuths. The rise of the internet in the late 20th and early 21st centuries only amplified his cultural impact, as online forums, Reddit threads, YouTube documentaries, and amateur investigators across the globe poured over the evidence, some claiming to have solved his ciphers, others proposing new suspects, each adding to the ever-expanding mythology of the case, until the Zodiac was no longer just a Bay Area killer, but a global enigma. And through all of this, his ability to inspire fascination as well as fear proved enduring, because people are not only horrified by evil, but also drawn to its mysteries. And in the Zodiac, they found a perfect vessel for both. A monster who was never caught, whose riddles taunted the best minds of law enforcement, and whose story blurred the line between reality and myth, crime and folklore, until he became a permanent fixture in America's cultural landscape. A symbol of unanswered questions, unsolved fears, and the darkness lurking just beyond the edge of the known. The legend of the Zodiac Killer lingers not only as an unresolved crime, but as a cultural phenomenon that continues to haunt America, inspiring endless debates, books, movies, and documentaries. And while the previous parts have traced the timeline of his killings, the cryptic letters, the police investigations, the suspects, and the near captures, the fifth and final exploration lies in the aftermath of the case. The legacy it left behind, and the chilling possibility that the killer may have walked among ordinary people undetected for decades. To understand this, one must look first at how the Zodiac case fundamentally changed law enforcement practices in America. Before the Zodiac, serial killers were studied in fragments, but his taunting letters, his game of manipulation with the press, and his cryptographic puzzles forced authorities to develop new methods of criminal profiling, psychological analysis, and interjurisdictional cooperation. And although those systems were imperfect in the 1960s and 70s, the very gaps the Zodiac exploited laid the foundation for modern forensic sciences, including the rise of geographic profiling and the use of behavioral sciences later seen in cases like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and BTK. Yet while law enforcement advanced, the public was left gripped by fear and fascination, because the Zodiac was unlike other killers. He didn't simply commit murders. He orchestrated theater, a macabre performance where each act was punctuated by a letter, a cipher, or a mocking phone call. And in doing so, he became not just a criminal, but an icon of terror, one who blurred the line between reality and myth. So much so that entire generations came to know his name, even if they didn't know the names of his victims. Consider this irony. The Zodiac's fame eclipsed the lives he stole, with David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen remembered less as individuals and more as the Zodiac's first victims. And that in itself is a cruel extension of his legacy, the erasure of humanity in favor of the shadow of the killer. And over time, as pop culture absorbed his story, from Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry to David Fincher's meticulous film Zodiac, the killer was elevated to a dark archetype, the faceless boogeyman who could be anyone and yet no one, an everyman monster hiding behind ordinary faces. And yet, in the midst of all this myth-making, real families were left with wounds that never healed, mothers and fathers who died without answers, siblings who lived entire lives haunted by the knowledge that the person who murdered their loved one was never caught. And for them, the Zodiac case was not a puzzle or a story. It was a whole carved out of their lives. Still, the human mind craves resolution, which is why amateur sleuths and professional investigators alike have dedicated lifetimes to solving the mystery, with each new suspect, each new theory drawing attention back to the case, whether it be Arthur Lee Allen, the prime suspect immortalized in Robert Graysmith's obsessive research, or the countless others. Richard Gaikowski, Rick Marshall, Earl Van Best Jr., and more recently Gary Francis Post, whose alleged ties to the Zodiac surfaced decades later. Each time hope rises that the puzzle will finally be solved, and yet each time, certainty slips away because the evidence is always circumstantial, the DNA inconclusive, the handwriting analysis contradictory, and the witnesses unreliable after decades of fading memory, leaving the Zodiac in a liminal space between truth and speculation, real and imagined. And this unresolved tension has ensured that the Zodiac's story never dies, because as long as he remains unidentified, people project their fears and theories onto him, making him not just one man, but a mirror, reflecting America's anxieties about evil hiding in plain sight, about the limits of justice, about the fragility of safety in even the most ordinary spaces. And perhaps this is the Zodiac's final triumph. Not the killings themselves, which were tragic but finite, but the way he has persisted as an unsolved riddle, embedding himself into the cultural consciousness so deeply that he is studied alongside Jack the Ripper. Both forever unsolved, both forever haunting, both symbols of how human cruelty can outlive even the perpetrators. And so the story of the Zodiac Killer ends not with a neat resolution, but with a lingering question mark, because though he may be dead, though his letters have long ceased, though the survivors have aged and the case files gather dust, his shadow stretches forward into every true crime discussion, every new investigation, every cultural depiction of the faceless killer. And in that sense, he achieved exactly what he wanted: immortality through terror, infamy through mystery, and a place in history as America's most elusive serial killer.